Hey there, this is Pat Ennis of Ennis Legacy Partners. Welcome to the Exit Readiness podcast. I'm here with co-host Walter Dial, who is tax partner at GRF CPAs and Advisors in Bethesda, Maryland. And my business partner, Corby McGordon, is also here with us today. Our mission on the podcast is to provide you, the business owner, with subject matter expertise on topics pertaining to building sellable or transferable business value, and then for planning your eventual exit from the business. We want to help you build a business that's transferable and then exit successfully on your own terms and conditions. In our last episode 102, I think, we discussed what do I need to think about before choosing a sale to insiders as an exit route. There are not a few things to consider before choosing this route, risks that need to be identified and mitigated. And so we're going to continue that discussion today in part two. The planning issues that we looked at last time in the last episode that we highlighted. Number one, the importance of identifying and testing any assumptions made by the selling owner or owners. We have found, our experience is all owners make assumptions. We all do about everything. And this is true for business owners who are thinking about exiting their business. They make assumptions about timing, about different exit routes. We need to identify those assumptions and then test them. That's one of the things that needs to be done with this exit route, like any other exit route, actually. And then number two, we need to consider the age of the employees interested in purchasing the business, or that the selling owner or owners are thinking would be candidates to buy the business. Because the age can impact the motivation or desire of an employee as it pertains to actually wanting to be an owner of a business. So that needs to be considered. There's a need to examine the risk tolerance of both the selling owner and the buyers. And the selling owner, lastly, the selling owner needs to understand the concept of lowest defensible value using that strategy. And then modeling cash flow is essential. That's true again for any exit route. And so those are the planning issues we highlighted in part one, which is the last episode. We'd strongly encourage you, if you're at all considering this exit route, sale to insiders, strongly encourage you to listen to episode 102, which is part one. And then today in part two, we're going to review some common mistakes that we would most often counsel or advise against. And they are these. One, selling too much stock too soon. Number two, including too many employees in the key employees group that's going to buy the business, or too many insiders in the insider purchasing group, if you will. And just being cautious about how many employees are in that group. And then two, along those lines, including employees in that group who don't like each other. Probably pretty obvious why that's not a good idea, but we're going to talk about it anyway. And then lastly, just giving you some tips on communicating with the insiders, the buyers, once the recommendation for this exit route is made. So let's get started with number one, selling too much stock too soon. Guys, Walter, Corby, what's your perspective on why this is something to be aware of and to be cautious about?
Well, I think it's just important that everyone involved in the transaction, knows exactly what they're doing, what their goals are. Because, for instance, selling a lot up front can be fine, but the owner has to be aware of the fact that, he's giving up control if he sells the majority share of the stock. And if at that point he doesn't have all his money, that's probably not the best idea. So just need to make sure that control is given up in proportion to the amount of shares that are given up. And sometimes we even will do things like, let the current owner retain voting stock. So maybe they do sell, a fairly good portion of the stock, but they're not giving up control because they're keeping the voting stock. So I think, the big point you're making there, Pat, is it's just important that the seller doesn't give up control when he still has a lot of money on the table.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, and I'd add to that. I think, sometimes when we hear that not giving up control, it can almost seem like a negative thing, that there's some lack of trust in the buyers, et cetera. But the reality is, as we've talked before, ownership is just a different animal. It's a different creature, and the seller has been doing it. And those that don't know what they're doing, non-decisions are decisions, which can derail the effective functionality of a company. So retaining control also ensures that the business is still running well, and that seller actually can keep it on course as he lets loose of the reins and lets the new guys take over and actually drive the ship.
Yeah, so we want to make sure that the owner's goals are being met before they give up control, financial goals in particular. And then two, that enough time has gone by before giving up control, where they've been able to see whether or not the new owners are indeed going to be effective owners. And they're indeed going to be able to take the business really to the next level. Because once you give up control, if you don't have all the money out of the business, all the value out of the business that you want to get out of the business prior to, you may not get all the money out of the business that you want to get out of the business.
Yeah.
Right? Any other thoughts? I think that's it, but any other thoughts on that piece?
Just one other thing, that it seems like it's very obvious, but Walter alluded to voting shares and non-voting shares. And at times I find that owners kind of miss the point that, if 80% of the stock is owned by someone else, 80% of the votes belong with those people, regardless of what somebody's title is. And so it just is that, stock.
Yeah, unless, and it's been recapitalized, if you will, into
Non-voting stock.
non-voting shares.
Exactly.
Which that is the strategy at times used to make sure that the owner, because if they want to sell a significant amount of stock, like in phase one of a two-phase process, then they may need to create non-voting shares where there might not be any currently.
Exactly.
In order to make that happen.
Yep.
Okay. Very good. And then the next two things we're going to talk about are very much related, but the first one of the two, including too many employees. Why do you need to be very careful and deliberate in how many employees are included in the employee buying group? What are some of the things that can go wrong if you have too many employees buying your business?
Yeah, I think, one thing, just in general, when the seller is looking into the future, he needs to picture how that company is going to operate. And if he was still running it, would he want all these people, as his partners or, co-owners? And the more people, the potential for more issues, in my opinion. And maybe I'm jaded.
Well, no, I think you just, like the rest of us, have enough life experience to realize and understand that where there's more people involved in a transaction, it's going to get more complicated and more potential problems.
I think it goes back a little bit to what we talked about in our last podcast. about, who are your key employees?
Mhm.
So, you're not just putting everybody in there who's, been with the company for a number of years. You really are looking at your key employee group. So that's going to narrow the group down.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Corby, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, it's that sage guru that once said, "Mo people, mo problems." It's true, and I find that at times people, owners with the right heart, the desire to really benefit somebody who's been a real participant in the company, can want to include somebody in ownership. But as we've talked before, ownership is different from being an employee, and even there, owners as leaders need to bring a contribution that is commensurate with executive level leadership. We want them to be contributors to the overall leadership of the company. So there are other ways to honor and financially bless loyal employees that don't necessarily include ownership of the company, particularly if that ownership winds up being voting stock and that they actually have an executive role to play when they maybe just aren't equipped for it.
Yeah, exactly. So that kind of gets back to our point about testing assumptions and how, because owners can, it's understandable, just make an assumption first that all of their key employees want to be owners.
Mhm.
And then number two, the assumption that they're also capable of being
Mhm.
owners. When we can almost tell you that if you've got 5 key employees, more than likely there's at least one, probably more, that aren't owner material. They may be fantastic key employees, but so yeah, more people, mo people, mo problems, as Corby said, more complicated. So more advice would be needed. And so that gets expensive. Okay.
Mhm.
More legal advice, more maybe, well, just more advice, period, in general. The planning process, the transaction can take longer when you get more people negotiating. It can just prolong the process. And of course, prolonging, again, translates into more expense a lot of times. More things can go wrong, of course, differing communication styles, personal goals and values. And boy, you better be clear on that real quick too. Personal goals and values, and then what each individual strategic goals are, strategic vision is for the company.
Mhm.
Is all that in alignment? And then other issues. And then two, with more people in the buying group, there's the potential for more triggering events like unexpected death or permanent incapacity or disability that need to be planned for. And oftentimes when that's planned for, it involves insurance and insurance premiums. And so again, more expense. So
Mhm.
just count the cost and be very deliberate and careful as to how many people you put into your or consider for your buying group. The other related issue is key employees or including employees in this buying group, key employee group that's going to buy the company who don't like each other or who don't get along now as employees. What would you guys say about that piece?
I think, again, the seller has got to be looking to the future of the company. And when you're selling to a group of people who are going to have conflicts, you've added a whole new risk factor to the equation that you'd be better off avoiding.
But the conflicts and the relational issues get so much easier when you're both owners of when you're owners of the company, though, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Somehow there's this sense of, again, those that are ready to be owners, some can walk in with, well, I'm in charge here mindset, and it can bring out the worst in people. let's face it, business is hard enough. It's complex enough to try to get everybody rowing in the same direction, even if everybody gets along, is a challenge, and boy, you start throwing some monkey wrenches in those gears in terms of interpersonal relationships, it can just really make it painful.
Yeah, we're not talking about everyone needs to be the same personality with the same
Not at all.
skill set or competence, or backgrounds and all like that. It clearly, that's not what we're saying, or that's not what we're saying, because that can lend toward a great partnership when you've got differing skill sets, complementary skill sets, complementary knowledge sets, and so on and so forth. Kind of like the three of us when we work together and serving clients. But in that, you need to understand that there's also the potential for conflict, like there can be with the three of us.
Mhm.
But you need to be able to, you need to know how you're going to work through it. You need to understand each other's communication styles, the core values. That's the glue, that's the foundation. And so if that's in place, then all the other stuff can typically be worked through. But boy, it sure does help when everybody likes each other. If they don't, and you go into it and everybody becomes owners together and they really don't like each other, it can impact performance on all levels, of course, impact employee satisfaction and retention. The selling owner may need to spend a whole lot of time resolving conflict, may even need to come back into the business at some point. And as a result of all that, the selling owner may not receive all the money out of the business that he or she wanted to get out of the business. So not a few things that, not a few things to consider just with that piece.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, just one other one there. A lot of times even the, conflict doesn't arise because one person is evil and the other one's good. Generally speaking, people want good things and they want good things for the business even. They just want slightly different things or have differing sets of priorities. And then, but it's human nature. If well, you don't agree with my wonderful idea, well, then there's, you don't like me or there's something wrong. It's easy to pick up personal offense. So just from the efficiency of everyone drafting along united as a leadership team, it can just make it extremely complex, even if everybody has the best of intent.
Yeah, let's mention a resource here that we very much believe in and have conviction about. And that's Patrick Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of, what's the title of it? 5
Dysfunctions of a team.
Yeah. If you have any questions about team cohesiveness, and pick up that book. It's a short read. It's written in fable form, and if you're not familiar with Lencioni, but very impactful and easily executed. Well, it's not complicated.
Yeah, exactly.
Not necessarily easy to execute, but it's not complicated.
Yeah.
Okay, let's lastly talk about communicating with the insiders after the recommendation to an owner to consider selling to the key employees. What does communicate? What are some best practices, if you will, here around communicating with the buying group, the insiders?
Yeah, well, because of my skill set, use numbers, not just words.
Yeah.
You want to model it out and show somebody what do the numbers actually look like. Because we can talk theoretically about, well, you're going to own part of the company, therefore the profits are going to help you pay for it. But we are talking, a buyer's personal financial well-being. They are making a financial commitment. And so, we model out often just various scenarios and then enable people to play what ifs, because there are so many moving parts to an insider buyout. Changing one assumption can really affect, the potential success of it, or potentially a buyer's, risk tolerance, if you will, when they start looking at what does it really look like to them personally, financially, and it just serves them to see a picture with numbers.
Well, yeah, and it generates a lot of conversation, doesn't it? And so
Yeah.
oftentimes that's where we'll start, is Corby doing his spreadsheet magic with the financial modeling. And of course, that's going to generate questions, concerns, and actually expose the reality of whether or not they really want to be owners. Because when you start asking questions like, okay, would you be willing to personally guarantee that loan right there, and at that stage to buy that amount of shares, and they start to think about the implications of personally guaranteeing a loan that big, and then they get their spouse involved, which we always encourage them to have conversations with their spouses about the numbers. That can result in a lot of words too. What about risk? What about, Walter? What are some ways that we can help these buyers or these insiders who want to buy understand how they might minimize the risk that they're going to be taking on? You have any thoughts about that?
A few things, and this is not just communicating with them, after the transaction, because, in the best case scenario, and the ones we've always worked with, both sides are involved in the entire process. And it's, really good back and forth. And that's when you end up with the best agreements and the best outcomes. Because, you don't, while, yeah, you can't anticipate every possible scenario going forward, you really want to try to avoid having any big surprises come up. And that's where Corby's modeling can be really, really helpful. Because if there's a financial, let's say you sell your company and COVID hits the next year,
Right.
it's nice when the buyers and the sellers all have an understanding of what can potentially happen in a situation like that ahead of time. The other, something else is, you do your best to get this group who's taking over, but what happens if you don't anticipate it, but there are people who all of a sudden they become owners and they don't get along, like we discussed, but previously they had, or maybe somebody just doesn't like the stress of being an owner or whatever. So it's important to have things in place, like non-competes, things like that, because you don't want people bailing. You're counting on this group to make the purchase and keep the company going successfully. So you have to put things in place that kind of tie them to the business, incentivize them to stay, and definitely do not let them just leave and start up a competing business.
Yes, and non-competes as part of the sale agreement. That's a smart idea. They need to be reasonable if they're going to be enforceable. But another thing that, the back and forth, let's say with the financial modeling that Corb does, it shows that they can actually pay the loan off in like 5 years. Well, the buyers might come back to the sellers and say, look, the modeling shows we can pay the loan off based on cash flow projections in 5 years, cash flow projections based on history, and then what we think we're going to grow in the next number of years. But how about some breathing room and let us do a 7-year installment rather than a 5-year? I mean, that can lessen or help to reduce the risk a little bit. So that,
yeah, I think that's really smart. And I know some of the deals we've done, it makes it a little more complicated, but we've put in formulas where the payments to the seller can only, there's a cap on them as a percentage of company profit.
Mhm.
And if for some reason the company has a down year, the payment just gets tacked on to the end. But you know, it is a team approach, the buyer and the seller. They're working together to make it successful. You know, that's an important concept.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. Another thing that's important is make sure that the buy-sell agreement is not just a template, but
Yeah, you're right.
it's well constructed with the right trigger events. You know, if you've got a number of partners in the buying group, you probably want to make sure, of course, death and disability are going to be in there, but sure that divorce is in there, bankruptcy in there, those kind of trigger events. So a well-crafted buy-sell agreement is very important too, and that can help to reduce the risk for buyers.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, I think another key element, Walter alluded to it in passing, but you know, when a buyer can see that, oh, I actually can repay this loan in 5 years, that can be confidence inspiring. And secondarily, a lot of business owners start businesses and they're generating an income, and they tend not to think of their business as an asset. By rightly doing the transition and talking it through, it starts the conversation with the new owners, connecting the dot of company profitability to their ownership of the asset of the company, which can tend to align them all in the same direction to say, wow, let's exceed our numbers, because that's going to put us all in a better personal financial position for this transaction.
yeah, that's good, Corp. Okay, so Walter, I'm going to ask you, you've frozen up on us. We can still hear you fine, but
Yeah.
so I'm going to ask you to summarize in a second. So, but that's part 2 of our 2-parter. The first part was episode 102. This is episode 103. And basically what we've been talking about is selling your business to insiders and what you need to be what you need to think about before you even choose this exit route. And actually before we recommend it. So Walter, give us a summary of what we talked about today, the good takeaways.
All right, I'll speak to you from the ether because you can't see me, right?
We can see your frozen face.
Oh, you can? Okay.
Uh-huh.
I hope I ended up on a nice pose.
Gorgeous. I was thinking it was,
So I would, you know, in summary, we talked about being careful and transferring too much stock too soon. And I think, you know, one aspect we kind of hit upon is the consideration of maybe you want to do something as far as breaking out voting and non-voting stock in some scenarios. You want to be careful as to the number of employees in the purchasing group. You know, this is definitely not the more the merrier situation. And then you need to also be careful how they relate to one another. You know, you don't want a team that's going to fall apart the day after the sale or 2 years into the sale.
Mhm.
And then there's, you know, communication is very key throughout the process. And also once the process is complete, there's some things you can do to reduce risk, like employment agreements, and provisions in the note that can account for down years, things like that. So I think this has been a really good 2-part series, Pat. I think it was a great idea you had to do it. And I think the listeners have probably found it helpful.
I hope so. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, one other thing that we often bump into, it seems that the owners and the insiders might tend to use the same attorney for all parties in drafting sale agreements and all the pertinent documents. And you know, we know it adds to the fees, but I think it would be our position, and tell me if you guys disagree with me, but that each party has their own legal counsel. Each seller and each purchaser has their own legal counsel. Would you guys agree with that?
I would agree with that. And I have a situation right now where a CPA firm in Virginia has a family-owned business doing a transfer from the founder to the son. And they brought me in just to be a kind of an independent do an independent financial review for the son. Because even though the son completely trusts this group, they just felt for their own, not really liability, but just for their own peace of mind, they thought it would be good to have someone else just take a look. And I think that's the same concept as having a separate set of eyes for the attorney. The attorney is at least as important, maybe more so.
Yeah. Well, and secondarily, the laws and rules are so complex, and the varied ways you can approach these are so complex. Just having additional sets of eyes on it just tend to yield a better solution in the long run that people are happy with.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, Corby and I are working on a case right now, and two different attorneys, and the other attorney, it kind of went down a rabbit trail, I think, and got everything kind of screwed up. But it's really enabled everybody to really dig into the transaction and the numbers. And even though it's to a large extent been somewhat of a waste of time, it has gotten everybody a much deeper understanding of how the transaction is going to work.
Good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, good. Thanks, guys. Listeners, if you want help in planning business continuity or planning your exit in any exit route, it doesn't matter which one it is, get in touch with us today at exitreadiness.com or through exitreadiness.com or email at exitreadiness.com. And if you're on that site and you set up a free account and then you want to purchase something and you use the code podcast, all caps, you'll receive a 10% discount on whatever it is you purchase. Everything there is virtual solutions for exit planning. So until next time on the Exit Readiness Podcast, this is Pat Ennis and Walter Dial with Corby McGordon signing off. Thank you.